Hi. So I just threw out the question yesterday because we are discussing um, that the Chazal made a special rule that if the army, if a city was taken sieged by an invading army, then all the girls, all the ladies are assumed to have been taken advantage of and raped. And therefore, the Mishnah said that if all the wives of the Kohanim were not permitted after the war is over, were not permitted to go back to their husbands, because the halacha is that if the wife of a Kohen that's raped, she cannot go back to her husband, even though it was against her will. So I was wondering, how was it after the war? Let's say a Kohen was married to a woman. They both were in concentration camp, and they met after the war. How did it work out that she was permitted to take her back? We learned that in order for him to take her back, she had to have a witness by her side all the time that can testify that she was not taken advantage of. And that's impossible. Almost impossible. So I just don't, and it must have been like, very hard for a Kohen after the war to get married again. Which I was just thinking about that, because these are the issues that we're discussing here. Anyway, today's daf is daf Chav Ches, and we're going to just carry on from the middle of daf Chav Zayin Omid Beis, just to catch up to the Mishnah, continuing along on this topic. We learned in the Mishnah that if the woman had a shifcha, a maid, right, then, and this maid testified that my lady was not touched by any of the military people, so then she is believed. Like, that's the chiddush over here. This is only a chumrah of chachamim to say that the woman was raped, and therefore they gave this leniency that even a maid, a goyish maid, can testify that her boss was not touched. So we had a machlekes between Rapapi. Rapapi said certainly she's believed. A goyish maid is believed. Rapapa said only his maid is believed. Her maid is never believed. Okay, it's because she's that's her main boss. So she wouldn't be believed. When the Mishnah says a shifcha is believed, it's only if it's his maid. And Rav Ashi said that here we believe a maid because we're asking a maid to testify, and therefore, if she's testifying, then she must be saying the truth. So the Gemara says like this because the Gemara wants to prove that even if you're scared to testify, right? Let's say the mafia put the fear of death, in somebody, not to rat them out. The person will speak, see something and say nothing. But to actually be a false witness, that a person would not put himself out like that. The Gemara tells a story. Kiha, like the following case: the Mari bar Isik. Let's get this a little bigger. The Mari bar Isik, the Armi lechonim bar Isik. This guy Mari, okay. This Murray inherited a lot of money. His father died, and this Murray is like a member of, let's say, the mafia, the Jewish mafia. And a brother comes from Bechazoi and says, "Listen, Murray, I'm your brother, and you inherited from our father a fortune. You're supposed to split with me." Amalei, so the guy said, "Let us split our father's inheritance." Amalei, so Murray told him, "I have no idea who you are." Also, Lakamid Rav Chizda. So they came before a judgment in front of Rav Chizda, right? Even though he's a Jewish gangster, but he respects Rav Chizda. Amalei. So Rav Chizda told the person that claims that he's his brother, in other words, that their father had another woman somewhere else, and he's the brother. Amalei. So Rav Chizda says, "Shapik hamalach." He's telling you the right. Mari is correct here. He doesn't recognize you. How do you know that you're not going to recognize your brother? It's your own brother. How could you not recognize somebody? Well, we find in the Chumash that Yosef recognized his brothers, but his brothers did not recognize him. The Ksiv, the pasuk says, "Vayakar Yosef es echav." Yosef, when they met for the first time, recognized his brothers. Vehain, the brothers, lahikiruhu, did not recognize Yosef. Malamed, this teaches you, Shiyotze b'lei chasimas zaken. Yosef did not carry a beard when he left his father's house and was sold to Mitzrayim. But when they arrived, b'chasimas zaken, he was wearing a beard, so they didn't fully recognize him. All 10 brothers. So therefore, he told the person, Murray is correct. He doesn't recognize you as a brother. He doesn't have to share his inheritance with you. Amalei, Zil Ais, so Rav Chiza said, Zil Ais Isadi da'achuhat. If you want to collect this inheritance, you have to bring proof, witnesses that he is your brother. Amalei, so the person answered, Isli Sahade, I do have witnesses. Mistafinu mine, but they're scared of him. They don't want to, they're afraid to testify because this will cause Murray a loss. He's going to have to split the inheritance. The Gavra Alamahu, he's a very strong man, and they don't want to testify. Amalei, Lididei, so Rav Chizda turned to Murray and said, Zil Aisinu at Alav Achucha. You have to now bring proof that he's not your brother. Amalei, so the person answered, Dina Hachi, is that the truth? Hamaitzi Mechavera Olivarai, he's trying to pull money out of me. He has to bring the proof, Murray answered. Amalei, so Rav Chizda said, Hachi da Einin Lach Ulukuli Alma Chavrach. This is the way I paskin, and all bullies or strong men like you, since people are afraid to testify against you, the onus is on you to prove the opposite. So the Gemara asks, so now Murray is going to bring the same witnesses to testify that he's not their brother. So the Gemara asks a question, if Murray is such a gangster, hashta nami asli mashakri, people are going to come to say lie on behalf of Murray to say that he's not their brother. And since the Gemara, tarte loy avde, even with somebody that you're afraid of, you don't do two things. In other words, there's one thing to see something and not say anything. Don't testify. But to ask somebody to testify who sees something and testify falsely, that means they saw what really happened and then testify the opposite happened, that they don't do. And the case is the same thing by a maid. A maid in certain situations will see her boss do something wrong, but won't testify. But to a maid to see something one way and testify the other way, that she'll never do. So if this maid comes forth, even though she is the maid of her, that means the wife is the boss, she will testify truthfully if indeed her boss, the wife, was not taken advantage of during this time. So she's believed. The Gemara says, let us say maybe it's a machlekes tanoim whether a lady's maid, a lady's personal maid is believed. Because the Mishnah says, one Brisa says, Zu edis ish v'isha tina v'tinokis. This is the witnesses where we trust a man, woman, a child or a girl, a via v'ima v'achia v'chaisa, a brother, mother, relative, a brother, sister, father, mother. We can trust them to say edis that this lady wasn't taken advantage of her. Avaloy b'na, we don't trust her own son. Ubita, her daughter. Loy avda, not her own slave. V'shivchasa, not her maid. We don't trust her maid. But then we have another brisa that says hakol na'amin laha'id. Everybody is permitted to say edus chutz mehemena ubala. Only she herself can't say testimony, and her husband can't say testimony about herself. But everybody else is believed. So what do you see from there? That her maid would be considered to be good. So this would be a machlekes tanoim, whether you can trust her maid or not. So the Gemara says the Rapapi Ravashi Tanohi. According to Rapapi, and Rapapi is Tanoi. It's certainly a Tanoim because they hold a maid is believed, and one brisa said a maid is strictly not believed. Her maid is not believed. The Rapapa said her maid is never believed. Lema Tanoi. You have to say it's a machlekes Tanoim because Rapapa's opinion is her maid is never believed. So, but one brisa says that sometimes her maid is believed. Amalach Rapapa, Kitanyahi, that brisa that says that her maid is believed is b'mesicha lefi tuma. We've seen that before, when her maid is talking offhandedly, not under the camera, not as an aid, but just somebody picked up a conversation. In the light of the conversation, it came out that her boss was not raped. That we would believe her. Rav Dimi Omar. Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael and said the following teaching. Rav Chanan was talking. There was a story that came in front of Rabbi Yeshua Levi. And others say, Rabbi Yeshua Levi Mishtari. Rabbi Yeshua Levi was just talking. A story came in front of Rabbi. But there was this man, who was speaking offhandedly. And he said, me and my mother were captured between the Goyim. In other words, there was an army that surrounded our city. I went to draw water from the well, but I kept an eye to make sure my mother was in my view so that she wasn't raped. My view was on my mother. If I left the house to collect wood, I was thinking about my mother to make sure that she was not touched. So he was saying the story not b'Torah's edus. He's a son, so he wouldn't be believed. He was just telling you how scary it was. I was always thinking about my mother, and it never left my mother out of my sight. But it wasn't b'Torah's edus. He was saying it just like a story. Oh, so that means her mother was not raped at all. You see, Rebbe said this lady, this mother, she was not, she didn't sleep with a goy, and therefore she was permitted to marry a kohen based on this testimony. The Gemara begins. Omer Rab Zcharia ben Hakatzav. Rab Zcharia ben Hakatzav said, he was trying to say that this is again a Tisha B'Av story. I basically swear. He doesn't really have to swear, but it's like he's like saying, I would love to swear that I was during the time, the siege of Jerusalem, during the destruction of the second temple. Okay, and I was there, and we were besieged. But like I'm telling you, my wife, Rabbi Zachari, was a Kohen. He's saying about his wife, her hand never left my hand. From the time that Goyim went into Jerusalem, so in other words, she was with me the whole time. I'm her husband. I can say edus that she was not touched by any of the Goyim. They told him too late. You can't say testimony for yourself. And a husband of a wife is considered ishtoi kegufa. It's like your own. And therefore, we don't trust you. You cannot stay anymore with your wife. You have to live separately or divorce her. So the Gemara continues. So he lost his wife. Tana, we learned in the Brisa, Ba'afal Pigin, even though probably he gave her a divorce, but he needed her to raise the children or the whatever. Yichad lo bayis b'chatzeroi. They both had same houses in the common courtyard. When he was in the courtyard and she wanted to leave the courtyard, she didn't want to be with him in the same courtyard because they're not married to each other, and therefore there's an iser of yichud. So therefore, when she would leave and go out of the courtyard, so her kids were in the courtyard, Yaitze Baroish Banah, she would leave the courtyard first, and then her children would follow after her. And therefore, and he was left alone in the courtyard. So therefore, never was he alone with her in the same courtyard alone. When she wanted to come back into the courtyard and he was there alone, Nichneses, she went in beside Banah at the end of her children. In other words, her boys walked in first, and then she walked in. So therefore, there was no yichud over there. So the Gemara says, Boya Abaya. Abaya asked the question, Ma'u lasis begrusha kain. Wow. A Kohen gave a divorce to his wife, right? So he knows you can't marry this wife anymore, right? So therefore, are they allowed to live in the same courtyard? In other words, they just got divorced. Can they both have houses in the same courtyard and constantly bump into each other? And if they bump into each other, they may come to, to yichud and have relations with each other. So the Gemara says, Hasabu, by the story of Rabbi Zechariah, de bishvui hekilut. They went lenient because it was a story of being captive. So we always go lenient because, at the end of the day, Zechariah's wife was never taken advantage of. Aval hacha, by the case of the divorce, we wouldn't be so lenient. Or maybe there's no difference. Maybe a kohen that just divorced his wife can also stay in the same courtyard. Tashma, come in here. The Tanya we learned in the Brisa. If a person divorces his wife, and let's say she married somebody else, even if he is Yisrael, if his wife married somebody else with the new husband, they cannot live in the same neighborhood, which means they can't live within 3 houses of each other. within, by three houses, one of them belonging to her former, her ex, and then another one belonging to herself. They can't live in the same, block. Vim haya kohen. If he was a kohen, and we're more stricter, not only can't they be in the same courtyard, even though there are a number of houses, they can't, they can't be in the same alleyway. In other words, they can't be in an alleyway where there's a bunch of courtyards entering the common alleyway. In other words, she has to move to a totally different area of the city. If it's a small village, right? It's any town USA. So where you're bumping each other on the, on Main Street. So therefore, that's a little too close for comfort. Zeham Maisa, this was a story. It's like a small block. They can't live in the same tiny, town next to each other. So we see clearly that if a kohen divorces his wife, they can't be in the same neighborhood as each other. Basically, they have to live far apart, so that they wouldn't come to, especially a kohen. They shouldn't be far apart. So the question is, let's say they both own houses in the same courtyard. Who has to move? They both own a house in the same courtyard. Who do we force to move? They're both divorced, right? So the Gemara says a psychological thing. It's much easier for a woman to move. A man, once they're settled, it's very hard for them to move. Let's take it, for example, if you had to redo your house. So you have to move out. So while they, rebuilding your house. So for a woman, it's easy. It's easier. For a man, he has his whole, office space or whatever. It's harder. So that's what the Gemara says. We require her to move. But he doesn't have to move because of her. But let's say she had a home in this courtyard, and he didn't have a home. So then he shouldn't buy a home. He has to move away from her. In other words, if he doesn't own a home in the same courtyard, he's not supposed to now buy one. Let's say they both have houses in the same courtyard, and they both own a house there. Tashma, come in here. That is the point of the brisa, that she has to move. But what are we talking about in the brisa? If it's his courtyard, she doesn't own a house. Pshita, of course she has to move. She can't buy a house. She can't live in that courtyard. He has the house in the courtyard and she has nothing. If she owned the house and the courtyard belongs to her, so he shouldn't buy a house in the same courtyard, of course. Vatanya, as we learned, he can't live there. It's this case that if both of them own a house equally in the courtyard, so who's forced to move? He's forced to move. So the Gemara says maybe that's not a proof. Tilma the Agameger. Maybe that Bryce is talking about they both rented a house in the same courtyard. In that case, you force her to move. But if he owns a house and she owns a house in the same courtyard, perhaps we wouldn't force her to move. So the Gemara says, "May have Allah." What's the bottom line? Tashma hine Hashem metal telcha metal telot gaver. It's like a curse said to Chizkiyahu, but God says, "I'm going to make you move around like the moving around of a man." For a man to move from his place is much difficult than a wife. So therefore, if we're going to require one of them to move, we're going to require her to move. Taramban, the rabbis taught, when a man divorces his wife, a kohen, let's say, or even a Israelis that's divorced, but she married somebody else, so they can't be with each other. Let's say he still owed her money from the possessions of her father, and she wants to bring him to Bezdin to pay up. She can't call him to court only through a messenger. In other words, she can't show up to court with him at the court at the same time, because in the end, they'll be in the same room, and that will lead to funny things. So we don't want them to be in the court at the same time. Rav Shesha says, if they come to court at the same time, we will not give them a seating. In other words, we throw them out. We put them in cherem. In other words, the fact that they even showed up to court both at the same time, we put them in excommunication, because it's well known when you get divorced, especially from a kohen, you can't be in the same area. We'd actually give them malchus for doing such a thing. Rav Nachman said, when do we say that we can't put a divorcee with her ex in the same room? Tana be'evel Rabasi in Masechta Smachos. This is a euphemism for Masechta Smachos. Is the Masechta that talks about Hilchas Avelis. It happens to bring up this discussion, and the Brisa says, when they get divorced from marriage, then we don't, we assume that they're so familiar with each other, we don't want them to be next to each other. Aval kishnskarsum and erison, if they were only engaged to each other, nifras al yedei atzma she'ein li by gaspa, then she could come to court and try to collect it by herself, because he's not so familiar with her. They never actually went through the wedding. So they're just divorced from erison, from just an engagement, and therefore it's not such a problem if they're in the same room together. The Gemara Brisa said, the Gemara tells a story. Hahu aris varusasai. There was this couple that was once engaged. They got divorced. Also, the Kame de Rava, they came in front of Rava. Yosef Ravada bar Machtan Kame. Ravada was in front of Rava. Oiki Rava shlucha bentaya. Rava did not allow them to be in the same room. He actually made the lady have a messenger, and the man have a messenger, and they both couldn't be in the courtroom at the same time. Amalei Rav Ata bar Matna, V'amar Rav Nachman, Tonabel Rabasi. Doesn't we learn that if they're just engaged with each other, we don't have a problem of them both showing up to court at the same time. Amalei, so Rava said, I looked at them and they looked too familiar with each other. And they weren't, they were, calling each other like by their first names and, very close. So therefore I said, they should not be in the same room. I don't want them to get chummy with each other. Ika di Amri, others say, the story is a little bit different, but the result is the same. Rava didn't notice that. Rava was actually the judge, and he didn't require a messenger. But Ravada, who was observing, you should give them a shliach. You shouldn't judge them, Rava. Rava answered, didn't we learn that if they're just engaged to each other, it's not a problem? So Rav Ada was the one that came up with this idea. If they're not familiar with each other, these people, you're just the judge. You're probably looking at your books, but I'm just an observer. I see that they're very, very familiar with each other, and you should be careful not to judge them at the same time. Make them have a shliach in between. New Mishnah. Normally, you have to say edus, what you saw when you were over bar mitzvah, and you say testimony when you're over bar mitzvah. Here you have somebody over bar mitzvah is saying testimony on an observation that he observed when he was under bar mitzvah. For example, there are 5 scenarios like this. Neman odom loimer, a person is allowed to say, zek sav yodei shel abba. If they're trying to verify and ratify a document to see if it's authentic, he can look at the signatures and say, I recognize this was my father's signature. He used to sign my report card that way. And therefore, his father maybe died, so he only knows his father's signature from when he was a young boy. So he's believed as a gadol to verify that's his father's signature. That's the handwriting of my teacher. It's the handwriting of my brother. Even though he only saw those handwritings when he was under bar mitzvah, he's believed. And the reason he's believed is because to ratify a shtar is only Rabbanan, and Rabbanan gave belief to a person to have witnessed the test, to witness the event when he's a cotton. So if he knows his father's signatures only because when he recognized it from when he was under bar mitzvah, that's good enough. But also you need a gadol who recognizes the signature, the other signature, along with him, because to ratify a shtar, you need 2 eidim, and one of them has to be a totally kosher eid, that he's saying eidus of something he saw after bar mitzvah. But anyway, that's the case. Here's case number 2. Here's a lady. She's claiming that she's a basula and that her ksuba is 200, and he's claiming that you're an almana. You're 100. So I recognize that she was dressed with a veil and her hair was uncovered when at her wedding. So based on his testimony, they're going to assume that she was married as a basula, and therefore her ksuba is 200, even though it's taking money out of somebody. But the Gemara is going to say that this is like, something that is just there were many people at the wedding, so he's just one of them. Even though he's saying testimony, I was at this wedding when I was under bar mitzvah, we trust him. He's testifying that so-and-so is a kohen. So he's testifying, this guy is testifying, I remember when we were in yeshiva together, he used to go to the mikveh to eat truma, or they would distribute truma with him by the granaries. So basically, he only testifying of what he saw when he was under bar mitzvah about so-and-so is a kohen. And we allow this person to become a kohen to eat truma d'Rabbanan. And then you can say this place is a field of pras. And that means only this place has a tumah of a bone fragment, and therefore Chazal said that if they plowed an area that had once a grave, an entire area of it becomes tameh, and that's called a beis hapras. It's a suffix tumah because we are afraid that when you're going to walk there, you're going to step on a bone fragment, and a little bone fragment the size of a barley could be mitama a person. So this person is saying, I remember this area was a beis hapras, but this area is not. He's defining which areas were the beis hapras and which areas are not. We trust him. Or he's telling us about a little village. Up until this point, he's saying, was the Tchum Shabbos. I remember I used to take walks Shabbos afternoon with my friends, and we all knew that up until this point was the Tchum Shabbos. So in all these cases, we trust him because it's D'Rabbanan, or it's something that, we could always, find out ourselves. So therefore, we can trust him. A person is not believed to say, somebody had an easement on somebody else's property. Somebody had an easement to make a hesped on somebody else's property. So that he's trying to take away a property that's presumed to be somebody else's by saying, I remember there was an easement over here. That we don't trust him, even though this is something that probably, maybe other people would remember. But since he's saying edus as a gadol of something he saw as a katan, that he's saying that the easement was, I remember an easement there when I was a katan, we don't believe him. The Gemara says, the only time that we allow a shtar to be ratified is by this guy is only if he has another gadol with him who recognizes other signatures in the document. So taken together, we would accept them, because to ratify a document, you need two people, and at least one of them has to be a totally kosher aid. Not saying testimony of what he saw when he was under bar mitzvah. Says the Gemara, I need 3 cases of signatures that the person recognizes. The ashminin of it. If I would say that the guy is recognizing his father's signature, a person knows his father's signature, even if he only saw it when he was 9, 10, 11 years old. He knows his father's because he's always around. His father's writing documents or signing checks. But I might think we don't trust him to recognize his teacher's handwriting. So the rabbi, if it would tell me that, if it would just say the rabbi, he recognizes, we trust him to recognize his master's handwriting, because he had fear of his master. So his master signed a letter to go home, or it's a report card. So therefore, he sort of figured out, even as a young boy, to memorize his Rebbe's handwriting. Maybe he didn't see his father's handwriting. His father's always at business, so we wouldn't trust him about his father's handwriting. If he teach me that we trust him by his father's signature, and we trust him to know his rabbi's signature. His father he sees around. The rabbi is like Einsa, and the rabbi because he has fear of his Rebbe. But a brother, he has no reason to recognize his brother's handwriting. Kamash Malan, that we trust him to recognize his brother's handwriting, and probably that will be it. Only his brother's handwriting we trust him. But to say that I remember a stranger's handwriting, maybe we don't trust him. So why? Since the whole idea of ratifying a star is only midrabanan, we trust. We could. The Rabbanan said we can take an edus like this. I remember that this girl was married as a basula. My tama. Why do we believe him? He's taking money out of somebody. You're telling somebody that your wife was a basula. You now owe her 200 zuz as ksuba. And says the Gemara, Kivan the roid benashim basulas nisais. Most women that are getting married are basulais, virgins. Gila milsa ba'alma. He's just telling us a fact, a known fact. And therefore, it's not an edus. He's just revealing a known fact, which can be verified by other people. Therefore, we trust him. If he says somebody, I had a friend in my class, and he says, I remember he used to leave the yeshiva to go to the mikveh to eat truma. So therefore, that person must be a kohen. So the Gemara asks the question, Vidilma Evid Kohenhu. Maybe the guy in his classroom was the slave of a kohen. A slave of a kohen, the goyish slave of a kohen, could eat truma. Messiah lay Rabbi Shua Levi, this will prove to what Rabbi Shua Levi said. Rabbi Shua Levi, also l'adam shalamidis avdei Torah. A person's not allowed to teach his slave Torah. So there was no reason for that slave to be in the yeshiva next to him. So the Gemara says, V'loi, is a slave not allowed to learn Torah? I'll prove it to you. With Tanya, we learned in the Brisa, love a rabbi. If the master borrowed money from his slave, Oisha also rabbi we go to Amid Beis, Chavchasum Beis, Apaitropi. If the rabbi made apotropos, if the rabbi made his slave like a caretaker of his properties, Oisha niach tefillin b'fnei rabbi, or the slave started putting on tefillin in front of his masters. And these are signs that it would almost think that the Eved, that the master wants to free the Eved. Or he read 3 psukim in the shul in front of his master. That's no proof. He didn't go free because that's just because that doesn't mean that the master wanted to free him. But what you do see over here is that a slave knew how to learn, knew how to read the psukim. So how can you tell me that you can't send a slave to the yeshiva? And so the Gemara Hasam the Ikri Evan Medati. That case is if the slave taught himself how to read Hebrew and how to read psukim, we have no problem. The master doesn't have to stop him. Ki Kamrinim, when do we say that you're not allowed to teach a slave Torah? Is the Konoig Be Minig Banim. He's like a regular Jewish kid going to yeshiva. That you can't do. Because again, if you had slaves going to yeshiva, people will think the slave is a regular Jewish kid, and when he leaves the yeshiva, he can marry a regular Jewish girl. So therefore, they didn't allow the slaves to go into the yeshiva, although the slave is chayiv mitzvahs, like a lady, but if he wants to teach himself Hebrew, he can teach himself Hebrew on his own time. Litbar lecha betruma draban. We only allow him to eat truma drabanim. We only allow this testimony to eat truma drabanim. And we saw that they used to distribute truma to my friend by the granaries. So the Gemara says, just because they distribute, when they're dishing out the truma by the granaries, who says that the guy that your friend was collecting truma, maybe he's not a kohen, Vidilma Evet kohen here, maybe he's a slave. And so, answers the Gemara, Tanan, Commander Omar, our Mishnah goes like the opinion, you can't give truma, you can't distribute truma to a slave only if his master is with him. Because if people will not realize that, they will see you distributing truma to this person, they're going to automatically assume that this person is a kohen. They're not going to assume that he's an eved. And then in another event, they're going to allow him to marry a Jewish girl. The Tanya we learned in the Brisa, Ein kolkin truma le'eved ela in kain rabbi imoy. You can't distribute truma to a slave unless his master's with him. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi yacholhu. You could he could say like to the owner of the granary, Im koin ani, if you think I'm a koin truly b'shvil atzmi, give it to me. Then eved koin ani, then if you think I'm a slave, truly you can distribute the truma b'shvil rabbi because because of my master. I'm the slave of a master. So Rabbi Raisi said that a slave could actually by himself collect truma by the granary. What's the machlokes? In the place of Rabbi Yehuda, they didn't allow that because anybody who was seen collecting truma by the granary was automatically considered permitted to marry a Jewish girl. That's why they refused to allow slaves to collect truma. In the place of Rabbi Yossi, they would not raise a person just because he eats truma to allow him to marry a Jewish girl. Tanya, in our Mishnah that says that we see them distributing to this person goes according to Rabbi Yehuda that only Kahanim were the ones that collected truma by the granaries, basically alone. So that was, therefore, it was a good edus. The Gemara just tells a story. Tanya, we learned in a brisa. Amr Rab Lazar bar Yossi. Rab Lazar bar Yossi says, "Meyamai lo yadati." I never want to say testimony for anybody. I'm just afraid that something bad can happen. Pam achas, one time, hey ati, I did say testimony. And what happened? As a result of my testimony, and they made a slave into a regular kohen and to a regular Jew according to my mouth. So Gemara says, they actually made an eved into a kohen. Well, that's impossible. Rabbi Lazar Rabbi Yossi was a righteous person. Hashta, we know ma behemtin shel tzaddikim, the animals of tzaddikim, ein hakadosh baruch hu maybe to kol al yodam tzaddikim outskin like kolshkin. This is a famous story with Rav Pinchas ben Yair's animal who would refuse to eat animal food that didn't had meiser taken from it. So if an animal of a tzaddik is protected from a mishap, certainly a tzaddik would not be involved in a mishap where his edus led to an eved being mistaken for an actual kohen. And says the Gemara, Ella Bikshulahal eved akunami. It was almost. They wanted to make an eved a kohen according to my testimony. What was the testimony? Chazah, he saw ba'asr Rabbi Yossi. He saw a person in the town of Rabbi Yossi collecting truma by the granaries. And then ba'azov asid ba'asr Rabbi Yehuda. And he said testimony that this person was collecting granary by in the city of Rabbi Yehuda. Whoa! So in Rabbi Yehuda's city, anybody who was collecting granary was automatically permitted to marry a Jewish girl. So they almost allowed this slave to marry a Jewish girl until until somebody came forth and corrected the situation. We learned in the Mishnah that a person is believed. He's allowed to say that I remember in my youth that this was a Beis Pras. This was a field that was only this area. A kohen was not allowed to walk on this area. My tama, Beis Pras Drabanim. The whole idea of an area being tameh, because you don't know where the grave is only Drabanim. Because if you plowed up an area that has a grave, midaraisa, you don't assume anything. But midrabanim, they were so concerned that maybe bone fragments rose up from the plowing the field, and they're tiny bone fragments you're not going to notice. So therefore, this whole thing is drabanan anyway. So you can trust a man to say, I remember as a child that this place was a Beis Pras, the other place is not. And how do you know this whole thing is drabanan? The Amar Rabbi Yehuda Mishmuel. We learned this in Masechta Psakim. We learned that if a guy is coming to do the Korban Pesach, so you have to do the Korban Pesach, and if not, you get kares. But now you have a Beis Pras, and you're a kohen on your way to the you're anybody on the way to the Beis Hamikdash. You don't want to become tameh. So the Brisa says, Rav Shmuel said, Minapeach odem Beis Pras v'hoylach. You can blow and your area and observe your area. Make sure, check that there are no bone fragments, and you can go. Rabbi Yehuda, so this would be only Rabbi Yehuda Amish made Rabbi Yehuda Amar Beis Pras Shenidas. If many people trampled over this Beis Pras, then you could assume that even a bone fragment of a small bone fragment was pulverized, tar. My tama, what's the reason? It's impossible for a bone that's the size of a barley not to have been trampled and pulverized by the foot. Anyway, what you see over here is that the whole Isser is only Drabanan, because if it was the Raisa, they would never allow such leniencies. So this whole union of Beis Pras is only Drabanan anyway, therefore they believe this type of aid. Adkan Hayinu Bar B'Shabbos. The guy also says, until here, we came on Shabbos. Kesavar, because this Brisa holds, our Mishnah holds, Tchumim, the fact that you can't walk beyond the Tchum Shabbos is only Drabanan. At the very least, 2,000 Amos, to walk beyond the city of 2,000 amas is only drabanan anyway. So you can trust the person to say, this is up until here was the Chum Shabbos. In fact, you can trust anybody because basically you could measure it yourself. So therefore, we can trust anybody. Let's just do one more line and then we'll leave it the rest for tomorrow. The ein neman loima derech hoya pliny b'makam hazeh ma'amid misbar hoya pliny b'makam hazeh. This was the last thing we learned, that we don't trust him to say that this person's property, there's an easement on his property. It doesn't totally belong to him. Somebody else could actually make a hesped on his property. They used to have, on the way back from the basic Kavaras, on your way home, they allowed certain areas on somebody else's property for the neighbors to make, let's say, a hesped that somebody died. So you don't directly go home, but you stopped along the way on different properties and made new hespedim. That's called mamid umisped. You stood and made hespedim. So basically, this guy's saying, I remember other people's properties had an easement which allowed neighbors to make hespedim on that property. So we don't believe him. My Tama, what's the reason? To take money from somebody, to force somebody to give up his property based on the testimony of an adult who's saying testimony of what he saw when he was a young boy, that we won't go that far. To taking money from somebody, you need a real kosher edus. So Be'ezus Hashem, we are going to start from the Tanu Rabbanan and Be'ezus Hashem to finish the parak and move on to the next parak, the third parak, Be'ezus Hashem tomorrow.